What do you need to do this? So you need at least one milkweed plant because you're not going to get monarch eggs without a milkweed plant. We think this project takes about 30 minutes a week. If you have one plant, it's probably going to take less than 30 minutes. If you have over 100 plants, it's going to take more than 30 minutes. And thank you for your data if you have over 100 plants. But we really want both ends of that spectrum. We want to know what it looks like for a milkweed plant the first year that it's planted. And we want to know for if you have 50 or 100 plants that have been there for a long time, how does that look for monarchs? Do we get different amounts of eggs between those things? You're going to need internet access to upload your data, but you've joined us here today, so I assume that's possible. Once in July, we're going to ask you to measure the space where the plants are. So you need some sort of measurement device, but you don't need that until July. And if you have a lot of plants, it can be helpful to use like a rope to kind of section off areas while you monitor, or like those flags like the utility company uses. This early in the season, it can be helpful to flag the plants so you don't have to hunt and find them every day. And your data goes into a national database. So this is really good news that this project is based on a protocol developed in 1997. So it's been going on for a long time. It goes into this national monarch larva monitoring project. So it's used by researchers throughout the country. We anonymize your exact location. It also means that you're not just helping us answer questions. And if we were to just stop doing this project at some point, your data isn't just sitting on some hard drive not getting utilized. It's in a national thing that's being used throughout the country to answer these questions. And because of the people who contributed last year, Illinois was one of the largest contributors in the Midwest. So we were very proud of that. In summary, what we're asking you to do, and we're going to go through that in detail, but in summary, once at the beginning of the season, like now would be good, you will answer questions about the site where the plants are. So often this is your home, but you can monitor at a place where you work or church or a park with permission of the landowner. It doesn't have to be your home. It just has to be somewhere you can get to every week with an amount of milkweed plants that you can reasonably count. Something like a 5-acre forest preserve, it would be great. If you were thinking about monitoring that, just go do the actual monarch larva monitoring project because they have a way to take a subsample of those. Our project is designed for smaller patches where you can count all of the plants. So then once a week, you're going to count all the eggs and caterpillars on those plants. So it is a weekly protocol that we ask you to do. And we understand that people are traveling. They might be taking a vacation this year. If you miss a week, it's not the end of the world. And then once one of the 3-4 weeks in July, you would take that measurement of the area. There's two things that the feedback from everyone was that was confusing in the past few years. And one of them is defining the site. So that's one of the first things we ask you to do. And as I said, that's usually it's where the plants are, your property, it could be your balcony. Sometimes people have more than one patch of milkweed. If you just have 5 plants growing in your front yard, then none of this is difficult. But if you have a bunch of different milkweed plantings growing around your house, you need to decide, are those distinct patches? The common separation is front yard patch and backyard patch. And you don't have to monitor both of them. If you only have time to monitor one of those, that's awesome. That's part of the reason that we have patches. If you have, like in this graphic, some plants growing on one side of your sidewalk or driveway and some plants growing on the other side, you have to decide if that is one patch or two. Partially that is like, do you want to monitor them together on the same day and they're not really that far apart? Then maybe they're just one patch. But if there's hardscape or a lot of turf grass between them, you could choose to make those 2 separate patches and only monitor one of them or monitor them on different days if it's too many to easily count in one day. So this is designed to give you the flexibility to decide how much you want to take on, or especially early in the project, we encouraged folks and they took on quite a lot and they're like, I was burned out partway through the season. So we would love to get data throughout the season. So kind of pick the amount that makes sense for you to do. To reiterate, you do not need to monitor all the patches on your site. Another reason that we do this, and this is a question we get asked a lot, is because some people rear monarchs. They collect eggs or young caterpillars and raise them in an enclosure like this to protect them from predators in their garden. And it's great. It can be a really fun experience to do with a young person in your life, or just because you want to do it. It's certainly something I've done with my kid. Um, Unfortunately, it's not compatible with a patch that you're monitoring for this project, because we're counting those eggs and seeing how many make it to each of the caterpillar stages. And if some disappear to become hand reared, that's going to mess with our data. So that's another reason that we give you the option to do multiple patches. So if you have a patch that you want to collect eggs, caterpillars, and food for them from, say, your backyard patch, and then monitor your front yard patch, that's a great way to do it. This is called head starting or hand rearing. If you are doing it, I really encourage you to check out the guidelines from the Monarch joint venture, and we can drop the link to that in the chat. Because there is some new guidance on like how to do it in the way that's safest for the monarch, because there are like diseases that can be passed between generations. So the other thing that's a little confusing is how we define a plant, which sounds like, wow, this field museum doesn't even know what a plant is. But you have to remember that this is going into a national database. And so milkweed looks different throughout the country. And so we had to decide on how to define this in a way that makes sense here in the Midwest, but also makes sense on milkweeds in Arizona, which I assure you look absolutely nothing like the milkweeds here. They don't even look like milkweed. It's very weird. So when you're monitoring each week, you're going to probably check your plants by species, because that's the easiest way to do it. Look at all your common milkweeds, write the eggs and caterpillars. Look at all your swamp milkweeds, write the eggs and caterpillars. I encourage you to do it at a time of day that's comfortable for you, in a way that is comfortable for you. Time of day is not important because we're doing caterpillars. That is not true for all things that you monitor. And you can divide your yard up using ropes or sticks if it's a bigger patch. And then when you go to count the plants, you're counting where the stem breaks the surface. Like this is a pretty straightforward example. The plant grows up, the stem breaks the surface, that is one plant. It can get a little goofy because some of the species break the surface and they start making a lot of branches. So you really have to get down there and look at the surface. Is it just one stalk that breaks the surface? Then it's one plant. Even though it can be confusing because there's way more leaves on this plant than this plant. This plant can even look bigger than this plant, but we're still counting it as one. And to some extent, the species really helps us with that because we know which species are more apt to do this. And then you get the situation where there are two stalks breaking the surface and there's a little dirt between them. We're going to call that two plants. A lot of people may know that underground, that is probably one plant. It's either growing clonally or sending up two stalks. And some species they just do that more than others. But we have to call that two plants to make all of the data work. And so it's really about getting down there at the soil surface and seeing if there's dirt in between the two stalks. So I got a couple of photo examples. This is actually, I think, probably from one of our milkweed giveaways. And there's like 5 or 6 plants in here growing in this tiny little area. But there's soil between each of the plant stalks or stems. So we would call this 5 or 6 plants. Here, you'd need to move the mulch away and make sure that it's at the soil surface and not at the mulch. But certainly the way it looks in the photo is that each of these stalks is a different plant. Even though underground, certainly these are this clump here is all one plant. You do have to move the mulch away, so don't let mulch and leaves confuse you. This is usually only confusing like either right at the beginning of the season or at the height of the season, because I should reiterate that also the number of plants will change. More plants will grow up usually as you approach July being the height usually, and then they start dying back in the real heat of August, and they just get devoured by the monarchs ideally. So you start losing plants literally to the monarchs. So here, this is a perfect example. If you move all of these leaves away and look down at the surface, this could be one giant plant, or it could be 2 stems growing near each other that we're going to count as 2 different plants. So you really have to get in there and look to know what you're dealing with. The feedback has been that this part is a little confusing. I hope that my explanation this year was less confusing than my explanation last year. You could always email us at monarchs@fieldmuseum.org. and we will give you that URL many times. You can send us a photo if it's confusing. Also, just do your best. Definitely please try to, count things the same all season, but don't over much worry. So this is an example of the data sheet, which you can download on the website where you probably registered for this. You can also just use a piece of paper, but we made a data sheet because we thought it might be a little easier. One thing that's nice is if you have multiple patches, you can just reuse the same data sheet until you run out of space. And so I named my patch for some reason front_Y, and I gave myself a reminder that that's the one by my driveway. And this can be really nice, especially if you name them like patch 1 and 2, and then halfway through the summer you're like, which one was 2 and which one was 1? I recommend a slightly descriptive patch name, and giving yourself some breadcrumbs to remember which is which, especially if you might take that vacation and come back a week later and go like, oh, I don't remember. So I wrote down the date when I monitored. I wrote down the start time and the end time. You don't have to do this, but it's nice for us because that is how we understand how much time we're asking you for. And it's just a nice detail to have. I wrote down the 2 species that I monitored, and I often do this like before I go into the patch because I know, okay, it's got common milkweed and butterfly milkweed. A third milkweed is not likely to show up, but the number of plants could easily change, and it will change throughout the season. So as I count them, often I use tally marks. I didn't do that on this example because it's kind of hard to read on Zoom. But I'll do tally marks of the plants I see. And okay, like I counted 3 eggs, and I saw a first instar or stage caterpillar. We'll go through that. And then I wrote all these zeros down. You don't obviously have to write down the zeros when you're monitoring, but please submit the zeros. Please really submit the data like from this butterfly weed, this example week, where I didn't get any eggs or caterpillars. Those zeros are really helpful to us because often one of the things we're looking at is the patches that got no eggs or butterflies or eggs or caterpillars for weeks compared to the ones that did really well, or the ones that got like the lowest 10% compared to the ones that got the top 10%. That's often how we're comparing the data. So if you just don't submit data for a week, we can't assume that you didn't have any. We just assume that you didn't submit data. So please submit data, even if it's 0. The back side of the data sheet, and Karen will show this in the survey, these are all optional things. It's lovely to know what's growing in your patch because that's probably one of the things that helps us understand why is one patch more attractive some weeks than others. You can write them down. You can use common names or scientific names, whatever you're most comfortable with. Please put a comma between them. That really helps us organize it. When you submit it, when you're writing on the data sheet, you can do whatever you want. And then we have this, the other things that you see. So I think one of the most special things about this project is the experience of returning every week to the same place and seeing what changes. And when you're in there focusing, looking for the little eggs and little caterpillars, you really do start to notice things. And I will go ahead and tell you right now that unfortunately a lot of the eggs and caterpillars will disappear. You're going to see a lot of eggs that don't turn into caterpillars. You're going to see a lot of young caterpillars that disappear. And they became food for something. And sometimes these things that you're writing down are the things that they might have become food for, or just other things that are in the patch. A patch that's really visited a lot by bees is telling me okay, there's other flowers there that are attractive for pollinators. But this is super optional. So in my example, I skipped it 1 week and I did it the next. In July, and Karen's going to show this too, and we're going to remind you again in July. You don't have to remember this for over a month. But every week when you do the survey, we're going to say, is it July? Not because we don't know what month it is, but because that's how we can trigger this little survey. So most of the time you're going to say no. And then 1 week in July, you're going to say, yes, this is the week I will measure my patch. And all you're going to do is kind of guess at the shape. And, if it's a circle, just measure the distance across. If it's kind of a rectangle, if it's a rhombus, just go with rectangle and measure 2 sides. That's all we need. And then the computer will calculate the area. And we're really looking for is how closely together the plants are growing, because that might be important. We're also going to ask you to kind of estimate where are the plants located in the patch? Are they like dead in the center, around the edges? There's some literature that indicates this might be important as well. And this is a new question for this year.